Today we are looking at a case from the late 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Minnie Wallace was born in New Orleans on the 14th of January 1869. She was a daughter of a lawyer named Mr. James Elijah Wallace and his wife Elizabeth. When Minnie was still quite young, her parents divorced, but they made sure that their two daughters were educated and learnt all the social graces of the time. Following the divorce, Mrs. Wallace opened a boarding house on Canal Street in the famous New Orleans district of Storyville. It was close to the very luxurious brownstone and marble bordello at 40 Basin Street that was constructed by celebrated bordello Madame Kate Townsend in 1863. Mrs. Wallace was a shrewd businesswoman. Both her daughters grew into very beautiful young ladies, and as their reputation spread throughout the city, she encouraged them to sing and play the piano to her guests. New Orleans was a bustling city. By the mid-19th century, the port had become the third largest in the country, behind the ports in New York and Boston, and by 1880, the city's population exceeded 200,000, making New Orleans the 10th largest city in the United States. In 1884, the city hosted the world's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition. At the time, nearly 1/3 of all the cotton produced in the United States was handled in New Orleans, and the city was the home to the New Orleans Cotton Exchange. The exposition was named the World Cotton Centennial, as the earliest surviving record of an export shipment of cotton from the US to Britain was from 100 years earlier in 1784. It was quite an extravagant event in an area that covered 249 acres and stretched from St. Charles Avenue to the Mississippi River. It could be accessed directly by railway, steamboat, or ocean-going ship. The main building was particularly grand, and newspapers had reported it to be the largest roofed surface ever constructed. It was illuminated by 5,000 electric lights and had an observation tower that could be accessed by way of an electric elevator, still quite a novelty at the time. The exposition opened on the 16th of December 1884 and ran until the 2nd of June 1885, and it attracted many visitors. One was a very successful businessman named Mr. James Reeves Walkup. He was 48 years old and originally from Marion County in Indiana, where he was born on the 10th of August 1836. He had fought in the Civil War and now lived in the town of Emporia in Kansas. He had made his money with the West Columbia Coal and Mining Company, and his life had seen much tragedy. He had married in 1856, but his wife named Anne died just a year later. He married for the second time in 1858 and moved to Kansas in 1867 with his wife and children. Here he purchased a farm where he reared cattle. He was also involved in railroad contracting and bought and sold grocery stores. His investments had made him very wealthy indeed. Around 1880, the family had moved again, this time to a town of Emporia. Here he became president of the council, and this meant that he would act as the town's mayor whenever the elected mayor was away. Tragically, his second wife named Hannah died on the 1st of May 1884, leaving him a widower for the second time. However, he had always been known as a gentleman who throughout his marriage had frequently entertained other women, visited prostitutes, and had a mistress many years his junior. Mr. James Reeves Walkup travelled to New Orleans in December 1884 to visit the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition. He was accompanied by a gentleman named Mr. Eben Baldwin. They had been told by a man they by chance had met in Baton Rouge that once in New Orleans they should stay in a boarding house on Canal Street in the famous Storyville district. He told them that it was owned by a lady named Mrs. Wallace, who had two extremely beautiful and very talented daughters. The two gentlemen each took a room at Mrs. Wallace's boarding house. They soon met Minnie and Dora, and straight away, Mr. James Reeves Walkup seemed to be somewhat besotted by Minnie. He told Mrs. Wallace that he would like to marry her daughter. It was not the first time that a gentleman had asked to marry one of Mrs. Wallace's daughters. They had become so well known for their beauty that men would come from far and wide to ask for their hand. A judge named William T. Houston had asked Mrs. Wallace if Minnie could live with him and his wife, an offer that Mrs. Wallace had politely declined. However, Mr. James Reeves Walkup was a determined character and was used to getting what he wanted. When he returned to Emporia, he wrote to Minnie. 4 months later, he returned to New Orleans. on the pretext that his daughter Elizabeth wanted to visit the exposition. They took rooms at Mrs. Wallace's boarding house on Canal Street. Mr. James Reeves Walkup again asked Mrs. Wallace if he may marry her daughter. He told her that Minnie would have everything she needed and assured Mrs. Wallace that he would also make sure that she too was well provided for. Mrs. Wallace told him that the decision would be Minnie's. Although Minnie seemed to find the offer of marriage quite agreeable, Mrs. Wallace insisted that before her daughter accept his offer, she and Minnie would first need to visit him in Emporia. They made the journey in July of 1885, and Mrs. Wallace was very impressed by everything she saw. The grand house with its fine furnishings. It certainly seemed that Mr. James Reeves Walkup was indeed a very wealthy and successful gentleman. Minnie agreed that she would marry him. He wanted them to be married straight away, but Mrs. Wallace told him that he would have to wait. She was anxious that her sister should be able to attend the wedding, so suggested that it took place in Cincinnati. This seemed like an acceptable compromise, but they were soon informed that as neither the bride or groom were residents of Ohio, they would be unable to marry there. Instead, they married on the other side of the Ohio River, in Covington, Kentucky. The ceremony took place on the 22nd of July, 1885. Following the wedding, Mrs. Wallace returned to New Orleans, while her daughter Minnie travelled with her new husband back to Emporia, where they were given a public reception by the town council. Mr. James Reeves Walkup was true to his words. Minnie wanted for nothing. She was now the lady in a fine house. She had staff, money and privilege, and a husband who adored her. She was, however, soon left to run the household herself, as her husband would spend some days away on business. He was a very prominent figure in the community and had to make sure that all of his investments were in order. He went to the city of Topeka, where at the time there was a rapid increase in property prices, and many real estate speculators were buying lots in the city. He returned to Emporia on Saturday the 15th of August and was greeted by his wife, but later that evening he became quite ill. Minnie sent for a doctor, and Dr. Luther Jacobs duly arrived. Her husband was in much pain, suffering from stomach cramps and being sick. The doctor made up a tonic and then left Mr. James Reeves Walkup in the care of Minnie. She was very attentive, and the following morning he had somewhat recovered. 2 days later, however, on Tuesday the 18th of August, he again became ill and again took to his bed. Dr. Jacobs returned, and by Thursday the 20th he felt much better, so much so that he was able to eat canned oysters, though this did not seem to agree with him, and he again became unwell. Dr. Jacobs returned to the Walkup residence, and by now was starting to think that something untoward was happening. He began to suspect that his patient was suffering from arsenic poisoning. This view was shared by Mr. Walkup's daughters. Like many residents of Emporia, they were suspicious as to why a beautiful 16-year-old would have agreed to marry their father. On Saturday the 22nd of August, his health deteriorated even further, but Minnie was not permitted to see him. It seemed as though everyone believed that she was responsible for poisoning her husband. Later that day, exactly 1 month after they had married, Mr. James Reeves Walkup died. The news of the death of such a prominent figure in Emporia soon spread around the town. It seemed that it was the only topic of conversation. Versions of how exactly he died were embellished, and the fact that only 1 month previously he had married a very young lady who was more than half his age was continually brought up. But when news emerged that they suspected that the cause of death was arsenic poisoning, many residents believed that Mr. James Reeves Walkup must have been deliberately poisoned by his young bride. The police visited the local pharmacies and discovered that Minnie had purchased strychnine the day before her husband became ill. She had also made 2 purchases of arsenic in the days that followed. Another pharmacy had refused to sell her any, as she would not state the purpose for which she required it. She was questioned about these purchases, but she innocently said that she had only used arsenic to rub on her face, and strychnine was used for the sole purpose of removing stains from her clothes. Fortunately, she had not used any of the arsenic that she had purchased, so agreed to give it to the police so they may weigh it. However, as she handed the small box to the officer, she accidentally dropped it. They attempted to recover the arsenic by collecting as much as they could from the floor, but it would now be impossible to ascertain if she had in fact used any. Mrs. Minnie Wallace Walkup was told that she must stay in her house while the police investigated the circumstances that had led to her husband's death. 2 officers were left to guard her. Soon after, some of her friends arrived to offer their support. A post-mortem was conducted, which concluded that the cause of death was beyond doubt due to digesting arsenic. Before the funeral, the pathologist removed the deceased's stomach, liver and kidneys so they may undergo further examination. The town seemed to be split over her guilt, as many believed that such a beautiful young lady could not be capable of such a terrible act. Others, however, were convinced that she had murdered her husband. Minnie's friends helped her to prepare for the funeral, but when the day arrived, she decided that it would be best if she did not attend. Instead, she stood outside the house in full mourning attire to pay her respects as the procession passed by. As soon as Mrs. Elizabeth Wallace heard that her daughter had been arrested, she made her way to Emporia and was accompanied by a Louisiana judge named William T. Houston. Mrs. Wallace was aware that the judge was somewhat infatuated with Minnie and thought that if she was found not guilty, he may try to marry her. She requested that the court appoint her a legal guardian, as she was still a minor. The court obliged with this request, and Mr. William J., who had previously served as the mayor of Emporia, was appointed her guardian. Judge Houston was so incensed, he left and returned to New Orleans. An inquest was held, in which a doctor named Charles W. Scott testified that the deceased had previously visited him, complaining of stomach pains. The doctor said that during the visit, Mr. Walkup informed him that he had been taking medication that contained both arsenic and opium. Dr. Scott said that he asked Mr. Walkup why he was taking this, and Mr. Walkup replied that he considered arsenic to be a male enhancement drug. There had been rumours that due to the deceased's promiscuous lifestyle, he'd ingested arsenic, as he believed it to be a cure for various sexually transmitted diseases. However, the autopsy had shown that Mr. James Reeves Walkup had never actually suffered from any such diseases. Following the inquest, it was concluded that the cause of death was arsenic poisoning, and Mrs. Minnie Wallace Walkup was charged with murder. The trial of Minnie Wallace Walkup began on the 19th of October 1885 and was a sensational affair. A prominent businessman dying of arsenic poisoning exactly 1 month after marrying a beautiful young lady, more than half his age, was always going to sell newspapers, and the interest was not confined to Kansas and Louisiana. The whole country seemed to want to read about the events that were unfolding in Emporia. Over 300 people packed into the city's largest courtroom, with hundreds more gathering outside. And the trial did not disappoint the journalists, who were anxious to embellish an already fascinating story. The defence offered a simple argument. Mr. James Reeves Walkup was known to be a gentleman who frequently ingested arsenic, and this had eventually led to his demise. Although this was their defence strategy, the autopsy had already revealed that the deceased had shown no signs of arsenic addiction. The prosecution case was very straightforward. The defendant had purchased both strychnine and arsenic and poisoned her husband. Although he had always been considered a respectable gentleman, now the life of Mr. James Reeves Walkup was paraded in front of the courts. His visits to brothels and bordellos, and his fear that he may have contracted a sexually transmitted disease. Prostitutes gave evidence, as did doctors, who claimed that he had told them he was addicted to arsenic, and there were pharmacists who claimed that he had purchased arsenic from them. However, none of these witnesses were from Emporia, and it seemed strange to many that Mr. James Reeves Walkup only seemed to have been reliant on arsenic pills when away from his home. There was absolutely no record of him ever buying arsenic from any local pharmacy. Mr. William J., who the court had appointed as Minnie's guardian, had put up $4,000 for her defence. She found it very easy to charm older gentlemen, and William J. was no different. He told the court that in July 1885, Mr. James Reeves Walkup had visited him in his office, and while there, put some white powder on a knife, before mixing it with a glass of water. He then drank it. Mr. J. said that Mr. Walkup had advised him to clean the knife, as the powder was arsenic. Minnie spoke in her own defence. She gracefully entered the witness box and told the court that she had purchased arsenic on the request of her husband and placed it in a drawer. Unbeknown to her, he had instructed a maid to bring it to him, and in his weak condition, did not administer the correct dose. He ingested too much, which led to his death. Her testimony was very emotional, and as she spoke, it was as though the whole courtroom had stopped, somehow captivated by her innocence and her beauty. She seemed to have captured the hearts of the courts, and public sentiment had now very much turned in her favour. When the jury was sent out to consider the case, they deliberated for 52 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty. Many believed that the reason was probably because they did not want to send a 16-year-old girl to her death. One juror later said, "If I had voted for that little girl's conviction, her face would haunt me to my dying day." Minnie inherited $250,000 from her husband's estate, and on the 19th of November 1885, she returned to New Orleans with her mother. As the trial had been so sensationalised in the newspapers, offers came in for Minnie to enter show business, but nothing ever came of this. She settled back into life in New Orleans, and later she started to be seen out with the former Louisiana governor, William Pitt Kellogg, a gentleman some 39 years her senior. She then moved to Chicago, a move that it was believed was paid for by Mr. Pitt Kellogg. In 1897, while in Chicago, she met a gentleman named Mr. John Burden Ketchum. He, like so many men before him, became besotted with Minnie, so much so that he divorced his wife, and he and Minnie got married in a secret ceremony held in Wisconsin. He made a will, leaving everything he owned to his new wife, and just 12 days later, he died. Due to the fact that Minnie's first husband had died of arsenic poisoning, an autopsy was performed. It was concluded that Mr. Burden Ketchum had died due to his addiction to alcohol, and no traces of poison or poisoning could be found. The Ketchum family challenged the will, but Minnie's claim was upheld in courts, and again, she inherited $250,000. Minnie took up poetry and even had a book of poems published, but she had little success as a poet. In the year 1900, Minnie became acquainted with a gentleman named Mr. Delancey Horton Louderback. He was married, extremely wealthy, and 20 years her senior. He was also a very prominent figure in the Chicago financial district. Mr. Delancey Horton Louderback became totally infatuated with Minnie. He would shower her with gifts and proudly parade her on his arm at social functions, and all this while he was still married to his long-suffering wife. Eventually, he built Minnie a very large and luxurious house, and together they bought the most extravagant furniture. Rumours had long since circulated that he had given Minnie precious jewels and money. However, Minnie never moved into the house. Instead, she wrote to Mr. Delancey Horton Louderback, informing him that she had moved to London. Her reasons for this were not clear. Minnie stayed in London, and the years passed by. When Mr. Delancey Horton Louderback's wife died, he sent Minnie a telegram asking her to return to America so they could be married. Minnie did not return. Instead, she sent a brief reply informing him that she had married a British Army captain. Not long after receiving the message from Minnie, Mr. Delancey Horton Louderback was dead. A post-mortem revealed that his death had been caused by cyanide poisoning. It was unclear whether this was suicide or murder. When his will was read, it was revealed that 25% of his estate had been left to Minnie Wallace Walkup. Mr. Delancey Horton Louderback had died in Chicago at a time when Minnie was living in London. Although she could not have directly had any part in his demise, speculation mounted that she may have had an accomplice who could have poisoned him. However, no charges were ever brought against anyone in relation to his death. Minnie eventually returned to America and lived out her life in relative anonymity, using the name Estelle Minnie Keating. She died in San Diego on the 10th of May 1957 at the age of 88. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.